Good morning, people of the Republic of South Africa, and welcome to the IEC's National Results Operational Centre in Pretoria, where behind me results are still coming in, but I have to say a much quieter morning here at the Tshwane Showgrounds, much like a morning after the night before, with many of the journalists and politicos here who might be suffering from what seems like a hangover, but a political hangover. Dawie, Scholtz, News 24's resident elections analyst, given the couple of earthquakes that we saw erupting yesterday, which we'll discuss. My name is Pieter. I'm assistant editor for In-Depth News. We've all had a couple of hours of sleep, which is always a highlight when you work here during the week of elections. And we are now trying to digest what happened yesterday and trying to make sense of what happened yesterday. Dawie, Scholtz, good morning. You look very fresh.
Thanks,
and
Pieter.
Up for today.
Yes, I slept for the first time in 48 hours. I feel fantastic.
I can see it.
Yes.
Dawie, we've got some wonderful and interesting results or forecast rather, to give to our readers and viewers this morning. eThekwini,
Yes.
an ANC-dominated city, the heartland of the ANC, or KZN has become the heartland of the ANC.
Yeah.
Give us insight into what your numbers are saying, what is going to happen in eThekwini.
Exactly. So overnight, we are now at 31% of the votes counted in eThekwini, so more than enough to be able to make a projection. And with our News 24 projections model, now just an extraordinary result. So the ANC projected to be at 44%, so definitely losing control of eThekwini outright. They will be the largest party, but losing their majority, and I'll reflect on that in a moment. The second largest party will be the DA at 26%, the EFF at 10%, then the IFP at 6%, and Action SA at 2%. And just a couple of thoughts on that, right? So
Dawie,
yeah.
just stop you for a moment.
Yeah.
Oh, stopping you for a moment, rather. The ANC losing control of eThekwini, a city they've governed for years and years and years. They were way above 50%. They're now deep below 50%.
Exactly.
That's an earthquake in municipal elections.
This is an absolute electoral earthquake. The ANC used to win 60% plus with absolute ease in eThekwini. In 2016, where there was kind of an electoral disaster for the ANC, losing their majorities in Gauteng, they still got 56% of the vote back then,
Which is sizable.
Which is really sizable. So if you do the math in your head quickly, they got 56 in 2016. They got 44 on Monday. That's minus 12. That's minus 12 in these last 5 years. It's just absolutely extraordinary. Where has it gone? I'm sure lots of the voters are asking themselves. So, firstly, 2% went to Action SA, right? So, I think as expected, Action SA mostly doing better in Gauteng, sort of a little bit behind in KZN, but still, that's 2%, right? The EFF number is the extraordinary number for KwaZulu-Natal and particularly for eThekwini. In 2016, the EFF got 4% overall. They're up to 10, right? So that's more than doubling, taking all of it out of the ANC basically. And the IFP went from 4% in 2016 to about 6.5% now. So that's really, really significant. It's a massive electoral shift. And of course, I think as we've been discussing with many of the other municipalities and essentially across the entire country, the kind of shifts have been at the demographic level, people moving away from the ANC towards the other parties, but that shift is then further amplified by the turnout pattern. The turnout pattern in eThekwini is quite a lot like it is in some of the other metros. So suburban turnout was roughly 55% in the election. In the townships, the turnout was kind of 41%. So
there's a massive difference between people that came out to vote in the suburbs, many of them traditional white DA supporting areas, and the townships traditionally black and ANC supporting.
Yes.
They just did not come out to vote.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what happened. And there's sort of, particularly within eThekwini, there are sub-pockets of the townships that I plot a little bit separately, and the one is areas that the EFF and the IFP, but particularly the IFP, have historically done a little bit better in. And in those sub pockets, turnout was 34%. 34. It's again crazy low, and part of what's really driving the ANC number down in eThekwini, but also nationally and frankly in all of the other municipalities we've been talking about.
Dawie, let's talk about turnout now. It's been a big theme across this election, across all the municipalities. The 34% number that you referred to now, that's disastrous for the ANC, and especially in a province and a metropolitan municipality, which has become the centre of ANC, the heart of ANC political support.
Yeah, exactly. Look, I'm not sure eThekwini is the heart of ANC support anymore, to be honest. I mean, perhaps KZN, but eThekwini certainly isn't. But you're right about the turnout point. And look, I think we can discuss. There's a couple of drivers, right, that we can think about. So for me, there's a kind of overarching driver. I know we've said it a lot, but it's just worth reflecting on. Is a very large portion of South Africa, in our poll, 70%, think that things are not going well. And a significant portion of those people clearly haven't found a different party to vote for yet.
Yeah.
So staying away is one potential answer, and I think that has a lot to do with it. There's also other things. I think it was a short, less resourced, in some ways less effective campaign by both the IEC, because I had a shorter time to plan for it, right? So you know those IEC posters that you often see everywhere. You just saw fewer of that.
Months and months of registration,
exactly.
And the opportunities that you have as a voter to register.
You saw much less than that in this year. But then the parties also, we know now with public disclosure, do not have that much money to go on. We know the ANC had financial woes, so they didn't have money to buy like oodles and oodles of television advertising, or to, for example, put up as much posters as usual. I, for one, saw fewer posters in this election than other elections. So the campaign was shorter and less intense. And that's another part of it. There's potentially some people who were concerned about COVID. I don't hold that hypothesis too strongly, and we can't say for sure whether that's the case or not, but I think that potentially is.
Yeah.
And then, look, I think it also it's if you look at who stayed away, it's specifically ANC voters in the townships, disproportionately who did not go to vote. And I think that's
been across the board. That's Tshwane,
exactly.
Joburg,
everywhere. And it's interesting. I think it has also a little bit to do with just being the last 2 weeks of the campaign just being atrocious for the ANC. Some of it their own making, but actually some of it like plain old bad luck. And some of it, frankly, a little bit like hubris and karma, to be honest, because if you've mismanaged Eskom for 20 years, then at some point it's going to bite you in these elections. And having load shedding at stage for 2 or 3 days before the election, I think just reminded a lot of people, annoyed a lot of people, and probably had an impact on the election. And then, as I said, bad luck that their big final rally rained out on Friday night, and it wasn't the usual visuals they get. So, and I just want to say one more thing about turnout. So that's for me the ANC voters, but it must be said that we've spoken a lot about low turnout in the townships, which indeed it was. The suburban turnout was higher and was okay, right? So we just said 55% in eThekwini, right? But the DA, I don't think will go to bed or didn't go to bed on Tuesday night and Wednesday night, or very particularly happy with that, because they could usually pump in these elections 60, 65, 70 in the town.
So that's also something that they should be worried about.
Some people in the suburbs didn't go vote in this election, and made the decision not to. And I think that's interesting. For me, it reflects potentially to a little bit of annoyance towards the DA, right? Because the DA has done okay in this election, but I think there's a lot to be spoken about their outcome, which is not that positive. And I think some of those voters are certainly decided not to go vote DA, and I think that's a subject for interesting discussion.
So the DA, according to our News 24 forecasting model, should settle at around 25.8% of support, which is 2 percentage points less than previously. Will they be, basically losing support but treading water, not really doing very well? In and amongst conditions that were very favourable to the DA to actually outperform if they had all their ducks in a row.
Exactly.
Is this, if you combine their expected final tally with the turnout in suburbs, is that a message that was sent to the DA by their traditional supporters, you think?
Yeah, look, I think so, right? And maybe just before I just answer that one explicitly, it's just quickly useful to reflect on the metros. Cape Town, the DA, down 8%.
Yeah.
Nelson Mandela Bay, the DA, down 5%. Johannesburg, the DA, down 10%. Tshwane, the DA, down 8%. Ekurhuleni, the DA, down 5%. Mangaung, the DA, I haven't run the numbers, sorry, I need to think about it, 2 or 3%.
Yeah, I think they almost stay the same.
Okay. And eThekwini now, this is the best actually, down 2. So it's down, but down less than the other metros. So there's something in the DA math that's problematic, right? And at the same time, we have this historic differential turnout in favor of areas that are voting DA. So if you look under that, right, and if you look at the demographics of who used to vote DA and what the voting patterns in those groups look like, that's where you can see the effect. And if you look at eThekwini, right, as the kind of discussion we're having now, and there's kind of two portions of the electorate that for me are super interesting. The one is that are now sort of the heavy DA voting portion of eThekwini, right? The one is white voters. In 2016, they won 88% of the white vote in eThekwini. Okay, that's high. They're down to 82. Okay, so that's not as bad as in some other places because, of course, those voters, there's no Freedom Front Plus really in eThekwini because there's not a lot of Afrikaans voters there. But Action SA did win 7% of the white vote in eThekwini, so some of that went to Action SA. The other one that's interesting to me is the Indian electorate because there's a lot of discussion about Phoenix, a lot of complexities around that portion of the electorate in this campaign. And the DA in 2016 won about 75%, I'd say, of the Indian vote. In eThekwini, they're down to about 65%, so minus 10, right?
So Dawie, if I can interrupt for a moment, and please don't lose your train of thought.
Yeah.
What you're saying is that conditions were absolutely perfect, all things being equal, for the DA to take advantage of the malaise in the ANC. That did not happen if you look at turnout, and certainly if you look at the final results.
Yeah, exactly. And if you for a moment imagine the kind of the 2016 turnout pattern, right? Let's just imagine ANC voters turned out like they did this year, and DA voters voted and turned out like they did in 2016.
Yeah.
This election would have been an absolute explosion. You could have seen the DA like maybe even winning majorities in places like Tshwane. Like it would have been fundamentally different.
Yeah.
And the reason why that's not the case is some DA voters, as I just said, didn't go to vote, right? We're at 55% suburban turnout. We're not at 70% suburban turnout like we were in 2016. And the DA is at 65% of the Indian vote in eThekwini and not with 75% like they were in 2016.
Let me ask you this. If traditional DA supporting areas turned out like they did this year, and ANC areas turned out marginally better, say at 50%, what would have happened? I mean, so keep DA supported or turnout levels as it is now, and just improve on the ANCs. If they got their voters out a little bit more,
the DA would have had an atrocious election. So I think that, so as we were saying, right, there are two mathematically in these models. There are two things happening, right?
Yeah.
The DA is doing great on turnout.
Yes.
So areas that typically vote DA are turning out more heavily. That's driving them up, right? And the scenario that you're sketching is sort of saying, let's imagine that wasn't the case, right? So that's the thing that's good for the DA in the outcome.
Yeah.
But then, so it's lots of votes there, but then you look at the votes there, and there's a fewer percentage of DA votes in that pool than usual.
Yeah.
So if you take away this turnout effect, the DA would have had a disastrous election. Like, there's no doubt in my mind.
And I want us to go through we're still stuck on eThekwini because it is a fascinating city, and it's the first big forecast of the day. But looking underneath the hood, and we've spoken about this a lot of times over the last 48 hours, we do need to interrogate the numbers a little bit more and look beyond the top line numbers, which the politicians on the floor are obviously crowing about, certainly on the DA side.
Yeah, exactly. We do need to, and we also need to look at them nationally, right? I think the one really interesting one nationally from a DA perspective is the Freedom Front Plus, right?
Yes.
Because in 2019 there was a crisis in the party about Freedom Front Plus voter, the DA losing white Afrikaans support to the Freedom Front Plus, right? And it was in the magnitude of sort of in the northern provinces, like 15 to 25%, settling on 18, 19, 20%, depending on where you looked, right? And that was declared a crisis in the party. So a lot of what has happened in the last 2 years has been about trying to get those voters back. Now, admittedly, we need to go do the election properly nationally, but it just looks to me like what happened in 2019 has either replicated itself, so the voters who voted Freedom Front Plus in 2019 did so again at roughly the same portion, and then in a couple of key places, they voted more Freedom Front Plus.
Yes.
Like in Tshwane, the Freedom Front Plus within the white electorate is a little bit more than it was in 2019. So the trend has continued. And just one thing that's interesting about that, right? And if you look at those 2019 Freedom Front Plus voters, they were more rural, they were kind of lower income, and small dorpy Freedom Front Plus voters, places like Lichtenburg, right? And places like, say, Waterkloof in Pretoria, right? High income, suburban, these are like old school, classic DA voters who have just always been voting DA. High turnout, high DA percentage, highly educated, high income, relatively liberal DA voters, right? It's just fascinating to see, and this is why the Freedom Front Plus is doing so well in Tshwane in this election, is that the Freedom Front Plus vote has bled in. It's not just in Lichtenburg and in rural kind of South Africa now with conservative rural Afrikaans voters. It's also in Waterkloof. Yeah. It's also now 15, 20, 25% in Waterkloof and in Arini and in
East of Pretoria, Constantia Park.
Exactly.
I just had a look at some of the voting stations. They're just random voting stations. Centurion to the east of Pretoria.
Exactly.
I mean, the Freedom Front Plus there in some instances went from 4 to 15%, and a couple of those examples exist.
Yeah, exactly. And look, the party has had a long debate about it. I'm sure they will have a long debate about it. Your and my opinion is not that relevant about the decisions they'll make about it. But I will say one thing. I will offer my opinion on this, right?
Please do.
Which is that pandering to those voters and trying to out Freedom Front Plus the Freedom Front Plus is not going to be the way to get those voters back. My view is that being a big, strong, diverse party that is scary to the ANC, that can take down and take out the ANC. I mean, look at these numbers. The ANC is on the ropes, right?
Yes, absolutely.
It's the next 5 years is the time, right? And what those people want is they want to take out the ANC. They want to get a new government in place, and saying that there's a big, united, diverse, large, sensible, centrist party, help us to build that party, is just by far, in my view, the strongest way to build that coalition. And out Freedom Front Plusing the Freedom Front Plus, I just don't think it's going to work, as it hasn't in this.
So we're speaking about the DA. We spoke about the Freedom Front Plus. I want us to touch on the EFF and the IFP in eThekwini as well.
Yes.
But the story of the election certainly remains the collapse of ANC support in many areas, and the fact that the ANC will now go below 50% in national support for the first time ever. We know national support numbers in a municipal election does not have bearing on national government, but it still is the best poll that we're going to get at this stage, isn't it, Dawie?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. So because the ANC is under 50, it doesn't mean anything. ANC continues governing nationally, continues controlling parliament, etc. But it's a symbolically a very important moment. The ANC has never gotten less than 50% in an election. And by the way, last night we projected 47.2% for the ANC. We've rerun the numbers now based on what came in overnight, and as projections sometimes shift, it's shifted slightly now to 46.5.
So it's even worse.
It's even worse, which is extraordinary. And the reason why it's even worse is because there's come more KZN voters come in, and the IFP, I think we were projecting them for 5.2 or something last night. They're up to 5.7. So in the projection, so more KZN vote coming in. The IFP looking even a bit stronger than we thought.
Just sticking with eThekwini for the moment, let's talk about the EFF, 6 percentage point increase
Extraordinary.
From 2016. That's a massive jump for them. The EFF will now be the third largest party in eThekwini. We know they've got strong support south of Durban. What do you make of the EFF support in KwaZulu-Natal? Like you said earlier, eating directly away from ANC support.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an extraordinary growth, right? So the EFF won 4% in the eThekwini's townships in 2016.
This is the best result, Dawie, I think, of all the metros.
I think so, yeah. We'll have to look closely, but the 4% in 2016 in the townships in eThekwini, they're up to 14. Those sort of portions of the townships where the EFF are stronger, that are kind of have a little bit more opposition voters in it, have been 7% historically. It's up to 19% in this election. So just huge growth for the EFF, and we saw this in 2019, and the trend has basically continued. I will say, if I look at the numbers, I'm looking at the 2019 numbers now and comparing them to this one, it's like the EFF made a huge jump in eThekwini and all of KZN in 2019.
Yes, they did.
They've just replicated that. It's not gone further. It's the same voting pattern that it was in 2019, which is interesting. And I think one can reflect for a moment on the EFF's overall result in this election. It's actually seems quite stagnant. It's interesting. They've stayed quite stable despite huge amounts of campaigning, huge rallies. It looked really good for them at one point.
And also conditions probably favouring them,
Yeah.
given the weakness of the ANC at the moment.
Exactly. And staying relatively stable, which is interesting. I think that the presence of Action SA creates another alternative for people who don't want to vote ANC, right? Which I think is a problem for EFF. And then of course also, in these townships where the turnout is so low, that's also where the EFF vote is, right? So it's driving down the ANC number, but it's also driven down the EFF number a little bit, I think.
Dawie, let's just, before we wrap up, another exciting day ahead. Just give us, we spoke earlier about Phoenix,
Yes.
the influence of Phoenix. We were able to track down at least one voting station.
Yes.
The Phoenix Technical High School, I think it was.
Yes.
And Phoenix, of course, in the one of the flashpoints during the 8 days of violence in July.
Yes.
And both the DA and the ANC gave up support, but the ANC gave up more support in that particular voting station than the DA did.
Yes, I think it'll be interesting to have a really close look at the Indian electorate in eThekwini, right, and at Phoenix in particular, right, given all the controversy around it. But the Indian electorate in aggregate in eThekwini, the DA has gone from about, as I said, 75 to 65. The ANC has gone from something like 15 to, it looks to me, about 7 or 8. So ANC support halved, DA minus 10, some of it going to action.
At that technical high school, you
Yeah.
gave me the numbers earlier, the DA went from 55 in 2016 to 50 this year, but the ANC dropped from 30 to 16,
Yeah.
which is much more significant.
Exactly. So maybe the first one of the two posters actually achieved
Yes.
what it was supposed to. I'm not sure the second poster achieved what it was
Dawie,
supposed
before we wrap up, and thank you everyone for joining us so early on a what day is today? Wednesday morning. Dawie, what are we looking out for? The results will probably be finalized
Yeah.
today. What are the trends that you are looking for today? And what can our viewers look for?
Yeah, look, so
at?
I think the trends are set in. I would be very surprised if we're talking about something later in the afternoon that we haven't spoken about yet. So
Yeah.
the one thing that's missing is Buffalo City. We'll do a quick Buffalo City projection.
Yeah,
I think with the
we
numbers
will.
are ready for that. But then I think today will be very interesting to delve a little deeper into some of the kind of complexities of the selection. The one for me will be having a deep look at Soweto. So we know Soweto has been an absolute just bastion, rock for the
Absolutely,
ANC. And in the early results that came in, it looked like Action SA was making huge inroads there. So I want to have a deep look at Soweto. I'm sure we'll tell the viewers what's going on there. And then the other thing that's just interesting that I'm looking at and going to analyze quite deeply today is with the Action SA support, particularly in Gauteng, the difference between the PR ballot and the ward ballot, and whether the IEC's decision had any impact on that. I've had a look at it. It looks to me like in Joburg, for example, in both the suburbs and the townships, Action SA won 18% on the PR ballot in both. So it's extraordinary that a party wins the same amount in the townships and the suburbs. Never happened before. But 18% in both. On the PR ballot, on the ward ballot, 14% on both. So that's a big difference, and it's either the biggest ballot split we've ever had in South African politics, or the IEC's decision not to have Action SA's abbreviation on the ballot had an impact on the ward. And we'll do that analysis a bit more broadly, and I think let the viewers know about the outcome there.
Thanks, Dawie.
Thank
Good
you.
having you here.
Okay. Cheers.
Thank you very much for joining us, and follow News24 for all the best and most up-to-date analysis that you'll find anywhere in the Republic of South Africa.